So which armies are winning and losing the most at the moment in Warhammer 40k? Let's do a big roundup of the numbers from a whole bunch of different sources since the balance update, and having a look at what's strongest and weakest right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a follow-up video on more army win rates with a bit more data, and this time looking at a whole bunch of sources and seeing which armies have been having the most impressive runs on the top tables. At the moment, it's now been 2 weeks in since the balanced data slate in terms of people being able to play tournament games with their armies. Really quite big buffs and nerfs in terms of points and rules changes and whole new detachments for certain armies. Last week I took an early look at some win rates. I thought we'd come back for a second pass. Now the stat sites have almost twice the data, and now a bunch of different ones have all posted their numbers, and interesting to compare and contrast between the two. As ever, there's a bunch of places that collect Warhammer 40k tournament stats. Maybe some of the best known and the ones that I thought I'd take a look at here are StatCheck 40k and Meta Monday. They both deal in big 5-round grand tournament data, collating win rates and stats with detachments and things. And also Goonhammer's 40k Stat Center, they collect data on from casual games via their Tabletop Battles app. That's probably going to have a few less hyper-optimized lists, but also has more data than the tournament games, which is kind of handy this early on. For this one I thought I'd go through in rough order of the StatCheck and Meta Monday data in terms of rough win percentages between them, but also look at the Goonhammer data for contrast, and have manually gone through the Best Coast Pairings and other tournament trackers out there to see which armies managed to win their first 5 games at a grand tournament, which should be a good metric for judging how well they're performing on the top tables. Obviously this is all still early data, though likely getting gradually better compared with last week. Obviously it's easy to be more sure of factions with a lot of data already, more so than ones that haven't had that many games. I'm sure the meta will still adapt. It looks like the Knights are probably about to hit it like an absolute truck, as both the Imperial and Chaos Knights with their new points costs haven't had a chance to play in tournament games yet. We'll talk about them at the time though. Let's go through them in order though, and first up these are the armies that have had the lowest win rates so far. Imperial Agents gets the obligatory mention, basically on plays and in serious need of help. No significant data, but what's there doesn't look good. Death Watch are perhaps kind of surprising to see down here, 36% of 80 games won, so again very little data there. Goonhammer has them at 43% of 145 games. Either way though, it's a tiny sample size. I expect them to rise up to more sort of mid-tier with more data. They were 50% before and didn't really get too much worse. For grand tournament stats, it looks like the army that's got the lowest performance is the Dark Angels at 41%. They've risen up 2% since last week's one, around about 270 games, and one player went 5-0 undefeated in the initial run. In the Tabletop Battles data, Goonhammer has them at more like 49% of over 1,000 games though, with the Wrath of the Rock at 48%, so it might be a bit of randomly swinging low in the grand tournament data, or it might be partly that the Wrath of the Rock detachment is a fair bit better in casual games than competitive, and that maybe wouldn't really surprise me too much in a sort of mighty defensive style one. It does look like the majority of people who are playing Dark Angels have been playing Wrath of the Rock at grand tournaments though, and just not really doing very well with it unfortunately. I do wonder if it might be a bit like Lion's Blade, having interesting stuff but not ultimately adding quite as much as the Gladius or Stormlance. I still wouldn't be surprised if they continue to rise a bit higher from here though. Feels like they probably had a bad initial starting couple of weeks. Next up we've got the Orcs. They've also risen up 2% in the grand tournament rankings, they're still only on 43. One player managed to go 5-0 undefeated. Goonhammer has them at 45%, so not really looking like they're doing much better in casual games either. Warhorde does seem to be the most popular as expected, though people are trying most of the rest. Obviously with the caveats of early days, it does seem like they're towards the bottom end of the 40k power spectrum. I felt like that seemed kind of likely by a few direct nerfs to some of their best units and combos. Seems that it doesn't mean that they can't win big in the hands of a good player though. The Black Templars maybe feel like the Death Watch, also towards the lower end of the win rate spectrum, but with a very tiny amount of data. One player had a 5-0 run and Goonhammer has them at 46%. A bit early to say too much about them, but it doesn't look like the points drops have initially made loads of people rush out to play them. And Index Space Wolves drops down a tiny bit to 44%, not many people playing with it. Space Wolves have their pre-order going live at the weekend, so it'll only be after those ship out that Games Workshop release the points and they start to hit tournaments in a big way. Goonhammer stats have them at 42% of 520 games, which looks like it could be a bit of an uptick, with at least a few people trying out Codex rules early. If so though, it's not looking very promising with those kind of results. Before we move onwards and upwards on the list, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold. They're makers of magnetic carry cases based in the USA. A custom built solution if you'd like to do that. Basically the idea being that you stick magnets on the bottom of your model bases so they stick in place and they don't slide about when in transit. They're all made by Sam based in West Virginia in the USA and ship out from there. The specific style of cases offered by them are these mag cases. The idea is that they're basically an incredibly sturdy MDF box, notably hard to break when they put together, and then in those boxes there are steel trays that slot in at the different levels, so you can adjust them depending on the height of the miniatures being transported. The models attached to those, and then on the front of the box is a nice acrylic sheet, so you can see your miniatures while they're in transit, which is nice enough for display. Broadly speaking, I've generally heard positive things about them from people who've wound up picking them up, both down in the YouTube comments and over on places like Reddit. Check them out, link down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their range. They've currently got a 25% off sale on for their Independence Day sale. I'll talk through a few of their options at the end of the video for those who are interested in them. Thanks to them for sponsoring this one though. Let's move up the list for 40k armies though. Next up we have the Adeptus Mechanicus at 46%, fairly similar to where they were last week. Nobody I could find having gone 5 games undefeated with them. Goonhammer has them a bit higher at 51% of 280 games. Either way, it's slightly low data compared with some on the list. Doesn't really seem like they've had enormous changes in their fortunes due to a few small points cuts yet, but definitely less info than most. The Genestealer cults are here and in a maybe fairly similar boat. 46% win rate, unchanged since last week. Not really all that much data. Slightly better performance with Goonhammer's mixed dataset, and one person with an initial 5-0 undefeated run. Drukhari are similar in the low data sort of area. 47% wins on the Grand Tournament front. 53% on the Goonhammer data. Doesn't look like any enormous changes for them after the points cuts and the re-rolls on the Sky Splinter. I don't think anyone was expecting this to revolutionise them, but certainly doesn't seem to have drawn any more people to fill them on the competitive scene than before. Their win rate numbers seem at least fairly in line with mid-tier factions so far though. Also on 47% so far are the Tyranids and Space Marines, both of those having risen up a tiny bit. Tyranids certainly seem popular at the moment, around 500 games recorded at grand tournaments. 3 players of which went 5-0 undefeated on their initial run, so at least some solid success on the top tables. That is out of a bigger number of people playing in the first place though. They also seem to be around about 50% on Goonhammer's data, so doing a tiny bit better there. I really wouldn't be too surprised if they return to their around about 50% that they've been at for quite a lot of 10th edition so far. Seems that quite a lot of people are trying out that new Subterranean Assault one with the ability to get some interesting movement shenanigans and deliver things close in for melee when it makes sense to. One of those got one of the tournament victories, which was fun. Though more people are still playing Invasion Fleet as a bit more well-rounded, and Vanguard's also popular. For the Space Marines, they rose up a good 3 percentage points on their previous week, which they did rather badly at. 47% wins, and again 3 people managing to go with their initial games 5-0 undefeated. Most people still going Ultramarines with either Marnius Calgar or Rabute Gilliman. One of those high placings was with a list without either though, which was kind of fun to see. Gladius remains the most popular on the detachment front, though Vanguard and Ironstorm also having some play. Also on 47% we've got the Astra Militarum as well. Looks like they had an initially quite good weekend at around about 50% wins, though have dropped down 3% from that. That seemed kind of lightly given that they were sort of 46% or so prior to the balance update, and their top builds for tournament performance certainly got some nerfs. Only the one person's managed to go 5-0 undefeated, and I think that was the recon element list with a vast amount of infantry that was quite cool. For the more mixed casual data, Goonhammer has them worse than this, 44% of around about 900 games there. They do look like one of the armies that might be struggling a bit more than most for the average player. It still looks like at grand tournaments Combined Regiment is the most popular, then Hammer of the Emperor. Index Chaos Knights is here as well, 48% wins, though that's probably not really the interesting bit. I think people are mainly interested to see what's going to happen with their codex when it goes live. Games Workshop gave them the points cost last week, so it means they haven't quite hit grand tournaments yet. Though I was interested to take a look at Goonhammer's data for just the post-points cost update. It looks like so far they're getting some crazy win rates around about 64% or so. That might be a bit of a warped figure for early adopters trying them out and people not being ready for them, but probably doesn't bode well for people trying to get in their way on the tournament scene potentially. I guess they probably won't settle as quite that high. I feel like Knights in general tend to do better in more casual metas than top tier competitive ones, but certainly looks like big stompy Titanic Walkers are back with a vengeance and going to hit tournaments hard this weekend. Next up, we've got a couple of armies on 48%, the Eldari and their hated enemies, the Emperor's Children. It seems the Emperor's Children are being at least fairly stable around about the 48% or so win rate, and that's really quite a big drop compared with previous to the balance update. They don't exactly have a lot of units to fall back on, and things like the Wings Demon Prince, Noise Marines and Lucius going up definitely had a direct impact on power. Looks like that's borne out by the Goonhammer data so far as well, which has got far more games on record. They still have won the single biggest event since the balance update with the Coterie of the Conceited. Seems that with the points updates, Games Workshop appear to have got them far more balanced than they were before. They were maybe a little bit standout strong. Feels like they now need to do something to make Fulgrim and Flawless Blades genuinely good choices, and hopefully the faction should be in a fairly good spot. Eldari seem to be holding steady at 48% wins as well. 2 people went 5-0 undefeated. I believe that was a War Host and an Aspect Host one. The Eldari just had some enormous nerfs to their Inari and Devoted of Iniad, and they also had some Aspect Warriors going up at the same time. Still certainly doesn't look like they're completely out of the running though. Pretty well in the middle of the pack, with War Host, Aspect Host and Seer Council being 3 ones that all seem popular with different players. Moving on to some sort of upper mid armies on the win rates, again very similar to the ones before. It does seem that Blood Angels are holding pretty steady around in the sort of mid to upper mid kind of area win rates wise. It does feel like they've got enough data to be at least somewhat sure of that, given that they've played 500 games at Grand Tournament things and 1,000 games for the Goonhammer app, and aren't having crazy standout performance in either of those. Looks like even with just massively discounted Sanguinary Guard, it was a boost that they certainly needed, given that it was quite so far down and struggling prior to the update. The massive points costs have certainly given them a big boost in faction popularity though. Most people using Liberator, maybe around about a quarter to a third using Angelic Inheritors with their character focused one. Looks like most armies have a fair fight against them, and perhaps Death Guard being really quite strong and popular might not be ideal for them. They can do counter melee really quite well and are very popular currently. Having lots of players and some decent enough win rates doesn't seem to have translated to any sort of success on the top table so far though. Seems that plenty of people have been going sort of like 4-1, but I couldn't find any examples of players going 5-0 undefeated so far. For the other very violent Space Marines in red power armor, the World Eaters are also here as well. It's interesting enough they seem to have pretty well the exact same win rates, but just far more performance on the top tables. 6 players going 5-0 undefeated rather than 0, and they also have 2 detachments that seem to be working out well for them. The general purpose violence of the Berserker Warband, the increasing numbers trying the Khorne Demonkin, with things like Juggernaut-led Blood Crushers and being able to fire Bloodletters into unlikely places. Then we've got the Sisters of Battle and the Chaos Space Marines, both on 50%. The Chaos Marines having risen up a touch, the Sisters having dropped down a tiny bit since last week. The Sisters seem a bit more convincingly mid-tier compared with where they were previously. They had loads of points cuts, and the change to the Champions of Faith does at least initially seem to have made that into a genuinely good detachment. The mechanics always seemed interesting enough, but having to pay a miracle dice for every activation was absolutely brutal. They're still one of the armies with least data, though it looks like Goonhammer with a bit more data seems to still have them around about the same sort of level. The Chaos Marines also seem to be doing similarly kind of well in the sort of mid to upper mid area. As before, mostly using the creations of Bile and Renegade Raiders. One person won a grand tournament with Renegade Raiders, and it doesn't look like anyone's trying to make their Cabal of Chaos work so far on the Psychic detachment front. Moving onwards and upwards and getting into the armies that are above 50% on the win rates now. Next up we have the Grey Knights on 51. Again, not so much tournament data here. Looks like one player's managed to have a 5-0 undefeated run with them. It looks like there's really quite a big disparity here between their tournament performance and casual game performance, Goonhammer having them on just 42%. They certainly do seem to have pretty low play rates at grand tournaments though. I feel like people's sentiment around them was that people weren't really expecting them to be doing particularly well post-update. And to be honest, it wouldn't really surprise me too much if their tournament win rates do drop down a bit from here. I guess we'll see there though. Otherwise, we've also got Chaos Demons here, who maybe feel a bit more firm at this sort of level. They're pretty similar to last week, 52% wins, and they've had a lot more performance on the top tables as well. No less than 6 players managing to go 5-0 undefeated in a row, so certainly showing that they can perform at the highest level of play when you've battled through many other armies that are also trying their best. It's still looking like there's a pretty even split between their Demonic Incursion and Shadow Legion, though after the update it looks like the Incursion seem to have been doing a solid amount better. Might be some element of randomness there, but it looks like it's got really quite a lot higher win rate. Next up, and also on 52%, we've got the Tau Empire. They notably had a particularly good tournament weekend last weekend, and as a result their win rates have risen up a bit on average overall, up to 52. 2 players managing to have gone 5-0 initially, though I did find it interesting to see that Goonhammer looked like they've had much worse performance for the Tau so far. Somehow, including a whole bunch more casual data, it looks like they're doing, if anything, one of the weaker factions in the game currently. If that data's accurate, then it looks like lots of people are losing with the experimental prototype Cadre and retaliation Cadre, whereas it looks like Montcar is maybe the biggest thing carrying the strength of the faction currently, at least in terms of win rates. Will be interesting to see where they settle with a few more weeks worth of data. My guess would have been that they would have been kind of mid-tier overall. Particularly given the casual data, I wouldn't be too surprised if they maybe just swung high a bit last weekend and might drop down a little bit more in the long run, though it certainly looks like they're in a much better place than they were before. Then we've got the Electus Custodes on 53% wins. They've dropped down a touch since last week, still remaining a popular faction, and 2 players went 5-0 undefeated with them. Seems their casual game win rates are also pretty similar as well, and the vast majority of people are still using the Lines of the Emperor, the recently received attachment they got at the last balance pass. Looks like quite a lot of high placings and a fair few undefeated runs, though no outright grand tournament victories so far for them. That often tends to go hand in hand with them being a bit of a stat check army. Next up though, and we've got the armies that seem to be performing the standout best so far. Necrons are up on 54% at Grand Tournament so far, with 2 players having gone 5-0 undefeated in the first 5 games. Though Goonhammer's data, including more casual games, has them a lot more mid-tier. Seems like they may be performing a bit better at a competitive level than casual, at least so far. They're one of the most popular armies to put on the table at tournaments at the moment, and they got some nice boosts at the balance update with cheaper wraiths and Luminor Serras. As before, the main detachment decisions seem to be between the Starshatter Arsenal and the Awakens dynasty, both of those doing adequately well enough, and some of the others are usable. I wonder if a few more people might be tempted by Canoptech Court in the light of some Canoptech unit discounts. Death Guard are at 55% and unchanged from the previous week, remaining the single most popular army to play at grand tournaments. They do have one of the very highest win rates in the game at the moment, and they also look like they've got the single strongest top table performance out of any of the factions, no less than 9 players going 5-0 undefeated in their initial 5 games. So that's 3 more than their next competitors, which just so happen to be 3 other Chaos armies in Chaos Demons, Thousand Sons and World Eaters. Not a bad time for the forces of the Dark Gods at the moment. They look like they're the single most popular one to play in Goonhammer's more casual dataset as well. A big 1600 games recorded, of which they've won 58% there, so if anything, even more standout. They've won at least 6 grand tournaments since the update, and for their detachments, most people are using Virulent Vectorium, though Champions of Contagion and Mortarian's Hammer are both popular and successful as well. Still seems that basically as predicted, they're one of the armies to beat in competitive play currently, and loads of people are playing them and you're quite likely to run into them on the way to the top. Currently they're not the highest win rate army at the moment though. The pre-update version of Imperial Knights already has a big wins of 56%. Looks like they've risen very slightly since last week, and they've had 4 players go 5-0 undefeated on their initial 5 games. Again, Goonhammer may be having even better stats for them with 58% wins on their more casual dataset. I feel like that often goes with expectations for Knights that often tend to do a bit better casually as opposed to competitively. A lot of these are with Canis Rex leading a massive amount of armigers, though some of the other big Knights are viable. The big and disturbing thing though is that it looks like Imperial Knights just got a great big buff. The armigers may be a bit worse than they are before, but the big Knights and Canis Rex himself just getting enormously better. I think most expectations is that they're going to be doing incredibly well at grand tournaments, and looking at Goonhammer's early data for people who've been playing casual games with the Knights after the points update, again looks like they've risen up to around about 62% wins or so. If that holds true into grand tournaments, then it's probably bad news for 40k game balance. Will certainly be interesting to see just how many big stompy walkers wind up blasting their way to victory at tournaments in the coming weekend. I'll certainly be interested to take a look as to what lists are doing well. Finally though, the other 2 armies with big high win rates are the Thousand Sons and the Leagues of Votan, both of these unchanged in their positions from the previous week. The Thousand Sons still at 56%, and again doing great on the top tables, 6 players going 5-0 undefeated. Overall looking like they're having a very good time since their codex, though maybe not quite as crazy standout performance on the casual scene, with Goonhammer having them at 51%. Overall though, they're definitely in a massively good place. They're hugely more popular than they are normally. They tend to be a kind of niche faction, both casually and competitively. Not quite so many people that collect them, but it certainly looks like they're out in force at the moment. Most people are running Grand Coven, which has around a 57% win so far, and then the Rubrique Phalanx and the Warp Meld packs also seem to be very viable as well and are doing well for a smaller number of players. Looks like they've won 2 grand tournaments so far, a bunch of those other 5-0 runs being at big multi-round tournaments or placing lower on points differentials, I guess. Then finally, still retaining their top spot for now at least, we've got the Leagues of Votan. They're on 57% wins and have dropped down just a tiny bit since the previous week. The amount of data for them is really quite small and feels less reliable though, just 190 games, and casually with a bit more data, Goonhammer has them at 49%, which feels a lot more in line with what I'd expect from them and how they were performing prior to the updates, which didn't really change anything for them. My guess is that they've just had a small amount of players do incredibly well with them recently, and that's certainly borne out by the top event placings. They've had no less than 5 players go 5-0 in the first 5 games. There's a massive success on the top tables for the low amount of people that are playing them. I guess there's just been a couple of weeks of really good times for some players striking big, though maybe their particular playstyle is doing rather well in this rather chaos-dominated meta. It seems like they've been putting in some performance against Thousand Sons and World Eaters so far at least. In any case, I'd still be predicting that they gradually drop down a bit from here. I guess we'll see what happens though with more games played. In any case though, let me know what you think of the initial tournament numbers there. Certainly seems like it's a good time for the Forces of Chaos and the big nightly stompy robots, though at least from the casual data numbers it looks like Knights might be hitting the meta hard and doing rather well when their new points and profiles go live this coming weekend. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts, insights and experiences with any of the factions down in the comments below. Finally, before I leave this one, I'll just cycle back to Tabletop Stronghold, the video sponsor. As mentioned, magnetic carry cases that are currently on sale for 25% off. For a rough idea of how many models that you can fit in them, here's the tray capacity for them, around about 90 25mm bases, or 30 Terminators or 6 Armigers. And then the cases have a number of different sizes and heights. This one's the mini one that's around about £66 or $75 while on sale. That includes shipping, but there might be VAT or sales tax on top of that. Even the mini one is at least bulky enough for some seriously big tanks and some Terminators though. The more standard size one is this regular mag case. This one's quite tall, as you can tell by the Chaos Knight hanging out in the bottom tier for this one. Hopefully should be a good size for a lot of people's more normal sized armies out there. They come with some magnets included for the bases. I'll leave the dimensions listed on the screen here. Then there's the really big one with the XL one, basically two of the previous attached together. Should be big enough to transport some entire armies and collections, and you can see the acrylic sheet on the front of this one for everything to be on display. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. You can find them linked down in the video description below if you'd like to check out their stuff. I'll leave that there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the 40k videos coming out each day. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page linked down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.